All right, today I'm going to be reading chapter 10, Parrot in the Oven. Our title of our chapter is called A Test of Courage. The whole disaster with Dorothy Giddens made me realize that I wasn't anywhere close to being smooth with girls. Not so much because I was ugly, although I was kind of ugly, or that I was a pest, although my sister Magna would argue different. It was because I was too chicken to ever say anything to a girl. Chicken with the sourest yellow. Just thinking about telling a girl I liked her clamped the muscles on my chest and made my lungs pull hard to catch a breath. Not that girls spit on my shadow or anything, but I would never be sweet enough to threaten cavities even to a girl like Imelda Rodriguez, who wore bottle glasses and had teeth going every which way. Melda wore clodhopper shoes and dragged a heavy shadow. I imagined her love would be a terrible howl of loneliness, but I would have adored her forever if just once she'd have tapped me with a shy finger of love. I told my friend Frankie about this. He lived near the irrigation canal at the far end of our projects, banked with scraggly oak trees and tall, speary grasses. Pollywogs wiggled away from approaching shadows and striped green garter snakes twined inside the leafy beds of dead stumps. It was a fun place to play, sometimes. Frankie said he knew what I meant, but that girls nowadays were impossible to talk to. Although he knew where I could get to know this girl real good, if I wanted an easy, I gulped like I'd just swallowed a delicious worm and said, "Really?" "Yeah, really. Tomorrow I'll show you." A red blush of sky was giving in to silver patches of moonlight when Frankie and I set out from Mondo's house and the Callaway projects. There, we found some guys hanging around a backyard. One was Mondo, another was his half-brother Eddie. A guy called Gotti, whose real name was Guillermo, was also there. And there were two girls named Rita and Patty inside the house. Somebody had been using the yard to fix cars. It didn't have a lick of grass on it, only packed in dirt stained with oil. Bald tires lay scattered around, and a chinaberry tree near the fence had a pulley chain hanging from a branch. The greasy chinaberries cruded my tennis shoes. Frankie said if I wanted to sit down, I could stand up a tire and crunch it down with my butt. I looked at the streaks of black grime on the rump of one of the tires and decided to stay standing. Along the backyard was an alley with a graped-out wooden fence. Broken boards dangled from rusted nails. Frankie told me that Eddie, Mondo's half-brother, cracked the planks with his foot when he drank too much and got angry about his mom dying of cancer. He warned me not to mention anything about mothers to Eddie. When he just starts going on about how you don't know shit, you just shut your mouth, okay? Rita and Patty were inside Mondo's room, which you could get into from the back porch. I wanted to join the gang because Frankie promised that I could kiss and make out with one of the girls when I passed the initiation. I was anxious about it and curious about how the girls looked. That's when Patty came out. She had beer-colored eyes and black hair plowed down the middle, flowing down almost to her hips. I remembered seeing her at school, her hair in the sun glowing like a fiery blue jelly. She wore cowboy boots and high black socks that led up to a miniskirt, so tight against her hips that she had to turn her legs a little sideways to walk. Patty smiled daisies at Frankie and play-tugged on Gotti's sleeves, but her best eye she saved for Mondo, making flirty winks and talking with a throaty voice. He craned his neck back, rubbed his wrist, and smiled with slit eyes. Me, she ignored and went back into the house. She was supposed to be Mondo's girlfriend, but Frankie didn't know for sure. He searched the clouds whenever I asked about her. That didn't stop him from making up stories when I got cold about joining the gang. He also said Rita wasn't as pretty as Patty, but said she'd let anybody kiss her, and that thought clawed up my throat, as did the way he referred to the girls as politas, which in Spanish meant little chicks. The word sent a current of excitement rushing through my chest. With the brim of his pachuco hat turned down, Mondo went around collecting dues. The plan was to buy a car. They figured he could drive, him being 17 and having a beginner's license. His aunt signed the papers at the DMV because he promised he'd take her to buy groceries when he bought the car. She wasn't so smart. In any case, Mondo didn't want a bunch of guys hogging up the seats, so they figured a few vatos firmes, firm guys, would do the trick. Hey, Essay, are you vato firm? He said, holding out the hat. His eyes stared at me from far away. Yeah, Essay. I dug into the pocket and took out all my change, about 18 cents, and dropped it into the hat. Did you give him the lowdown? He asked Frankie. Yeah, I told him. The lowdown was that I had to pass the test of courage to become a member of the Callaway Projects gang. I'd also get to make out with Rita, which, as I found out later, was a rule made up while trying to decide if girls were even going to be in the gang. Rita suggested it, although she added that she wouldn't let anybody actually lie down with her. She didn't mind making it seem close, though. It was one of those evenings when the moon comes out early and looks scarred with a dark rash. Mondo passed around some Lucky Strike cigarettes, shoving them out like tubes and watching to see if we were thankful or greedy. So, he said, Frankie says you've been to juvie. No, I've never been to juvie, I said. I was embarrassed about having to admit it. Frankie must have told him I've been in juvenile hall to impress him. Well, I've been to juvie, Mondo said. Once. He nodded slowly, getting everybody's attention, and lit the cigarette. He handed me the match, and when he did, I caught a glimpse of a tattoo in the shape of a C on the fleshy bridge between his thumb and forefinger. Me and some guys from Holloway Projects got caught stealing this car. We didn't mean nothing by it. We just was going to cruise around and drink beer, go check out the Ruckus on Belmont Avenue. He used to do it all the time, you know. We'd take the car and dump it over by Chinatown. The owner'd get it back the next day, sometimes with more gas in the tank than when we got it. He winked over at Frankie, his cigarette pinched between his fingers, then took a giant drag, letting the smoke pour out between his lips in a tight blue vapor. You ever stole a car? He asked, choking a little. No, sorry, I said, regretting again my mousy admission. Never, Mondo asked in mock surprise. He turned sideways and raised an eyebrow at the guys. I thought he was going to make fun of me, but then he said, don't worry about it. It ain't no big deal. Really, it ain't no big deal. He spit out a speck of tobacco, then walked over to the fence and flipped his cigarette into the alley. It hit a puddle somewhere and made a sizzle. Besides, we ain't stealing any more cars. Ain't that right, Frankie? Frankie was searching for matches. He found a book and began lighting everybody's cigarettes, all except Eddie's, who had hooked his behind his ear. I hadn't smoked my own cigarette either, and couldn't remember what I did with the match Mondo handed me. Those days are gone, Frankie said, arching his shoulders. Simon, I say, those days are gone. Mondo agreed. He puffed his cigarette again, then crooked his fingers in the shape of a claw and circled them around. We're going to buy a car, Essay. All of us, except maybe you. He shook his fingers out, sweeping them over everybody, then curled them in again, leaving only his thumb out, the one with the tattoo. He pointed it at me. It depends on whether you pass the test. Right, Frankie? I tell you, Frankie said, with exaggerated toughness. He's Bernardo's brother. He'll probably kick all of our asses. Not mine. He won't kick my ass, Eddie said. Stepping out of the dark of the alley, he'd been listening near the fence. There was threat in his voice, and his face was gluey from drinking. Night train. He had long hair, almost as straight as mine, moss thin and blonde, and a pale bedsheet color face. His eyes were nickel blue, like light flitting off the shank of a sharpened knife. Calm down, Eddie, Frankie said. I was only kidding. Eddie smiled like he'd got one over on Frankie, then lit his cigarette. When Frankie had first told me about the initiation, I pumped my fist in the air with showy bravery. The initiation was to test a guy's courage. You could either sissy out or have Mondo think you were brave enough to stand the punishment. Actually, it wasn't the pain of getting socked and kicked that bothered me, but more the pain of feeling afraid. When chicken feathers choke in your veins, being afraid could be a real knife in the ribs. Then any disgrace is possible. I worried that I'd start begging, maybe even drop into the ground, paralyzed with fear. Like in the war movies when the bombs drop, shocking with dirt. When Mondo announced the beginning of the initiation, a rash of alarm broke over my skin. Patty and Rita came out from the back porch. Patty still wearing her tight skirt and Rita a rusty leather jacket about 3 sizes too big. She was giggling one of those long streamer giggles, and looking at her, I felt mushy around my shoulders. She had on one of those wrinkly short pants that flared like trombones. There was a crease between her legs, like somebody had lightly taped a finger there. As they walked slowly down the concrete steps past the blistered paint on the screen door, the late moonlight shadows stretched lazily across the greasy yard. Mondo invited the girls to watch, but only if they weren't squeamish, she said, winking at me. Then, without a warning or even a nod signaling a beginning, Mondo and Eddie began circling around me. Frankie and Gotti snuck glances at each other, their faces rubbery, like they'd been slapped. I knew they weren't the serious ones. Suddenly, Eddie dropped to the ground, and before I could lift my leg, he hooked his left ankle behind my heel and shoved at my knee with his right foot. My knee hinge locked, and I fell backward on my butt. I whirled around quickly, almost flailing to stand up. But before I did, Mondo clamped his hands on my head and forced me down. Next came a thud against my ribs as he sunk his knee into me, and a glancing heel burn on my neck from Eddie. The circle shrank in around me from the corner of my eye, moist and dripping. I saw Gotti, Rita, and Patty inch closer. Frankie stayed back. Suddenly I felt a foot pressed down on my hand. It sprung alive with needles, and jerking my chin sideways, I saw Rita, her mouth scrunched tight, grinding her heel into my hand. From then on, I only remember a storm of cuffs and chops and kicks hitting me as I thrashed under Mondo's grip. He crunched his knee against my head, scraping my eyebrow against the oil-crudted dirt. I tried twisting my body around to get up, yet for every strain, Mondo pressed harder, shifting the weight of his knees to counter my thrust. I could smell the acidity stink of the dirt, but strangely enough, there was no fear, nor could I feel the blows, which felt like instead of me, they were hitting a slab of meat on a table. In my mind, I kept saying, "Okay, you bastards, go ahead, see where it gets you." I knew that this had to be about the stupidest thing I could think about at the time, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I had a thought that once whatever it was being tested came out, I'd get to go to the back room where a couch lay against the wall, and there I'd kiss Rita and Patty, just like Frankie had promised. Finally, I would hug a girl full in my arms, smell the mustiness of her breath brooding deep inside my nose, feel her lips smashing like a kick against my mouth. When they finally let me up, I sat there for the longest time dabbing my lips, swelling fast, flaring alive with throbs. There was also a bruise on my hand, trimmed black around the edges. My muscles felt weak, like mush, and all over my body my bones echoed little pinpoints of pain. I was squinching my eyes, trying to squeeze every last shudder of hurt and shriveled away, when I heard Patty laughing behind me. She had a snappy laugh, like she expected everybody to crack a rib alongside her. "Ah, quit worrying about your lip," Eddie scolded. "Shut up, Eddie," Frankie said, flicking dirt off my hair. "You'll be okay," he said, soothingly. He put his arm around my shoulders. "You'll be okay." All right, that was the end of chapter 10. We have one more chapter left.